just wanted to welcome everyone for the seventh time. And but I want to say, I think I asked David 2 or 3 months ago. I've forgotten when to cap the series with meditation for 4 reasons. One is that my understanding of meditation is that it engages a lot of the brain's real estate. That's David's term, and that's reason enough. But also, meditation might throw some light on consciousness and awareness, that kind of bugaboo in neuroscience. And David also knows a great deal about meditation. In fact, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've been rereading a book that he gave me many months ago, but on meditation, but why Buddhism is true. So, David, I'm going to publicly thank you. But David's also made major contributions to the library series, the Nobel series, I think for 3 years. And he's covered the economics and peace prizes. Those are not easy things to do. I always thought that my pieces on science were relatively easy. So, David, it's yours. And thank you very much for taking this responsibility on. I really look forward to it.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. Well, you probably should wait to the end before you thank me.
Okay. All right.
This, of course, as Monty Python says, and now for something completely different. This is quite a different presentation than we've been used to from Bill, partly because of the subject and partly because he knows a whole lot more about the brain than I do. So I decided to start with this slightly whimsical, but not entirely, picture of Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. And they're having a sort of meditative conversation. "What day is it?" asked Pooh. "It's today," squealed Piglet. "My favorite day," said Pooh. In meditation, one of the aims, and certainly one of the types I'm going to be talking about, the aim is actually to make every day your favorite day. So I do have brain scans and all of that, but fewer certainly than we've had in the past. So Bill asked me to start talking about what is consciousness. Such an easy task, Bill. I'm very grateful to you. And surprisingly, we don't know much more about consciousness than we did years ago. This is an article which appeared obviously in The Economist. So here's a very brief history. And as I say, we don't know a lot more now than we did back then, although it has a significant importance in meditation, and I'll be getting into that. I actually think in 1688, John Locke got it pretty well. He said, basically, I don't know what it's for, but for the rest of our body, but for our thoughts, it's absolutely essential. So consciousness, without consciousness, your thoughts are in big trouble. Leibniz came along a little later, and he did a famous deal where he said, well, consciousness, the mind is like a factory. It was the Industrial Revolution. So we walk through a factory, we see all the mechanisms, the machinery and so on, but we don't see consciousness. You can't see it. And we went along a little farther, 1866, T.H. Huxley, a famous man, and he said, I think, pretty much where we are now. If there's anything as remarkable as the state of consciousness that's just a result of some nervous tissue, apologies to any neuroscientist, but it's just as unaccountable as the appearance of the jinn when Aladdin rubs his lamp. So that's some background. We have an update though. Francis Crick, our famous DNA man, just before he died. In fact, the paper was published after with his fellow scientist, Christoph Koch, decided that the colostrum had something to do with it. And it's, I gather, and Bill probably knows more about this, but it's a fairly thin membrane that goes to both sides of the brain. But as Crick and Koch discovered, it has connections throughout the brain on both sides. There's two of them, left side and right side. So that is an advance. And now let's go on to another little, this is my little take on Leibniz. We'll say that the brain now is sort of our hardware. And we can look at the hardware. It doesn't really tell us very much. And it's a bit along the lines of what Penfield did, identifying different parts of the hardware and saying what their function probably is. But it certainly doesn't tell us anything about consciousness, or indeed much about meditation either. Just to carry on, and every generation seems to pick something local. It was the Industrial Revolution with Leibniz, so it's computers with me. And this would be the software. And the software in this case, I'm just sort of equating with what the brain does, and particularly with your thoughts. So we think we're very smart in year 2000, that with all the great studies we can do of the mind and the brain. But in fact, humankind has been studying the brain for a long, long time, has a long, long history, many colleges and what we would consider universities over the last 3,000 years that have nothing but concentrated on, not the brain, but on the mind, on controlling the mind, on figuring out what the mind did, on trying to figure out how best to deal with the mind. And it began in India with the Vedic scholars about 1500 BCE. So we're being proper and we'll say BCE. And it began with the kinds of things you hear about. The aesthetes, the meditators, the wild men who lived in the woods and were considered wise. And as I say, there were these universities and people came from all over India and went to them, and they studied the mind from the inside, not from the outside, but they would examine their thoughts, go into these deep states, discuss things. They were looking for similar things that we're looking for: how to make ourselves happy, how to deal with the lives they were faced with, and so on, and how recognizing the power of the mind, how it would come about. They also came from a monotheistic point of view. They believed in God. So they believed in one God, but they also believed in a lot of other gods. So we see them. But it's an important thing to consider that meditation started with an idea of a supreme being. And of course, in Hindu philosophy, you go through a whole series. You're sort of born from the source. You go through a whole series of incarnations and you return to the source. Well, so that was 1500 BCE. And, oops, why can't I advance here? I'll do it that way. But of course, the studies changed somewhat about 500 BC when a gentleman came along that you probably recognize as the Buddha. And in a way, I mean, many of the things I'm going to say today are some theories of mine, so you can always come along. But in a sense, Buddha reformed Hinduism. He was a bit like the Luther putting the things on the wall, and he refined it. But he came from that same tradition. His meditation would have started as a Vedic style meditation. And the people that he encountered, the adepts and so on his wanderings, that eventually got him to meditate on his own sets, were also the Vedic scholars, Vedic. So we know what happened. He was born in a palace. He was led a very protective life, and then went out into the world and realized there was a lot of sorrow in the world. There was sorrow, there was sickness, there was death, poverty, suffering, and he wanted to find a way to end suffering. And just in a nutshell, he thought that through his meditations, his under the Bodhi tree, his enlightenment, and all that we can get into, he thought that the answer would be to work with your desires, lessen the desires, become detached, and you would then not have all the suffering involved with living in the world. So that was, in a very brief and nutshell, the Buddha. Very important and extremely important to the way we meditate today, as we'll discover, or many people meditate today. So before I go on, I thought that I would just review what is generally used as meditation these days. And as I say, it's so easy, it's hard. So I'm going to tell you about the easy part, that's setting up. And the hard part is that, like anything else, it's practice that takes you there. And we'll see that today in some of the slides and the scans that we look at. The more you practice meditation, unquestionably, the better you get at it. So that's really the key. But I can be pretentious and say, I'll teach you the basics right now. And the basics are always the same for everybody. You set up something in front of you, a table generally, it can be a candle, a flower, a photo, anything you like that you can focus on, that you would like to focus on, or it can be your breath. And certainly the gentleman we saw in the previous slide, the Buddha, preferred the breath. And that's also got a lot to do with what we're going to see when we look at some of the scans today. So essentially, you sit on a chair or a cushion. We often see people sitting on a cushion. You keep your spine erect. You relax your hands, and it doesn't matter if you do this with your hands or this with your hands or put them by your sides. It doesn't matter where they go. It just should be relaxed. One hand over the other is fine. You then decide whether you want to close your eyes, open your eyes, or half open or close. I was taught to do the lion's gait, so when I meditate, I half close my eyes. And the only other thing you have to do is breathe softly. Often people, before they meditate, take a cleansing breath and exhale, and then you simply let go. And that's it. That's the easy part. So let's go on to the next slide. So now's the harder part. You try to still the mind, and stilling the mind simply means you get to a position where you have no thoughts. And this can be a challenge, and it can be a huge challenge for a lot of people, but it is the key to meditating. What you want to do is stop thinking. And when you stop thinking, you do go into a different zone. And even if you've never meditated before, you probably can find in your first 10 or 20 minutes, and don't meditate for longer than really 10 minutes, 5 is probably enough. You will probably notice that you can stop the thoughts, but they return almost immediately. And when they do return, you concentrate on whatever it is you chose to concentrate on, the candle flame, a photograph, an inspiring photograph, or your breath. And Buddhists, and we're going to talk a lot about mindfulness, they use the breath. So it just means that you sort of try to go blank, and when you don't succeed, or as soon as you notice that you're thinking, you focus on breath or on one of the other things. So here was the revelation that I had with meditation. There should be an N on meditation. That wasn't the revelation. The revelation I had when I first started was I tried to stop my thoughts, and then they came back, and I photographed them. I looked at the candle, or in my case, I was using candle flame, and I could get them to go away very briefly, and they'd come back, and this kept going. But in the process, when I finished, after the first 3 or 4 attempts, I realized something that I had remembered from when I was a kid. I was watching my thoughts, and I was fascinated with the idea that you could watch your thoughts. So it meant, for one thing, that you weren't your thoughts. There was something else other than your thoughts. So who watches your thoughts? And here is someone trying to meditate and having a lot of thoughts. Well, I'm going to make an outlandish suggestion and say that when you stop your thoughts, that silence that you go into, that meditation that you go into, is in fact your consciousness. It feels like your consciousness. The longer you meditate, the more you feel like that is your guide. That is what is taking care of you in the world. It's that miraculously, it just feels like it. It's that silence that you get into in meditation, which reminds me of a couple of stories. I was having a class at McGill at one point. We had about 40 people in the room, and people talk and make suggestions. And one of them said, "Oh, let's meditate in the dark with the lights out." So this was a tilted assembly hall. We had about 50 people, and we turned the lights off. So all there was a candle on a table in the front. This quite large room, pitch black. And of course, no one is saying a word. They're all trying to be silent and get into their meditation zone. And suddenly the lights come on and a guy screams. It was the janitor who was checking the rooms. He opens the door and sees 50 people sitting there in the dark. So that was one story. And another one is a quote from Noel Coward, who I liked. And in one of his songs, he says, "Don't let consciousness be your guide. Common sense is a far more reliable one." So you always have that to look back on. So we also have been studying the mind since 2000, since about the 90s. And this is how we do it now. We don't do it by sitting in a lotus position and going inside and trying to figure out what's going on there, watching ourselves with our consciousness or with whatever it is that watches ourselves. We wire ourselves up. This is a EEG, and this particular monk is a Tibetan monk, and one of the first ever to undergo this procedure. So he's hooked up to an EEG, which measures brain waves on the outside. And this setup was inspired by the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama has been a tremendous force in spreading meditation in the West. Mindfulness essentially comes from the Dalai Lama. And it's I'll get on to it. There are different forms of meditation. Mindfulness now, Buddhist meditation, mindfulness are essentially very similar, not exactly the same, but similar. And the person who has done it and who has inspired all the research that we're going to see today is the Dalai Lama. He also inspired something, the setting up of, and I'll send you some links and books at the end if anyone's interested. It's the I'm forgetting what this is called, and I can't see it. But anyway, it's the Mind and Life Institute, sorry. And it was set up in 1987 under the auspices of the Dalai Lama with some money from Western contributors, and it is still going today. It's a very important institution, and I urge you, if you're interested in the latest in meditation, to go and look at the Mind and Life Institute online. The Dalai Lama has also encouraged Western research, and he sent the monk we just saw for the first scans in the West. And this is Richie Davidson. In about 1992, he did these first scans with EEG that will measure brain waves, essentially. And so let's see what, and he is now still very active. He has been very active. We're going to look later at one of his bigger studies, more complex studies. And again, a lot of this has been under the auspices of the Dalai Lama through the Mind and Life Institute, which I urge you to have a look at. It's the really intellectual side of meditation. All the heavies are there. And they meet regularly and have meetings and so on. Very inspiring. So this is what happened with Richie Davidson, when he first wired these people up. They got he and a friend called Lutz gathered all this data and then analyzed it. And these are the 5 types of brainwave. Delta, which has to do with sleeping. Theta, when you're somewhat awake. Alpha, idly thinking thoughts. And I have these more. Beta, now you're active and having your ordinary everyday thoughts. Yeah, delta, sleep. Theta, you're drowsy. Alpha, you're sort of relaxed, but having a few thoughts. And beta is you're alert. And then there are gamma rays. Gamma rays, and this was where the shock for Davidson and his buddy were. Gamma waves are very unusual, and they're generated often in people when you have a sort of flash of intuition. So the example that Davidson used was, say, try to find the link between these 3 words, sauce, crab, and pine, a one word that is common to all of them. So sauce, pine, and crab. The minute you get it, you get a burst of gamma waves. So the answer is apple, applesauce, pineapple, and crab apple. And when you had that, you get a burst of gamma wave, and it lasts a second. It's detectable, but it's just boom and it's gone. Well, when Lutz and Davidson started analyzing these printouts that they got from wiring up that monk in 1992, they saw that the gamma wave, it actually started before he meditated, when they had the thing on. When he meditated, it got incredibly intense. And then when they removed them, he continued to stay in that state, and they found it astonishing. From all the work they'd done with EEGs, they just were blown away by it. So that was an early study. And basically after Davidson had seen that, he'd always been interested in meditation, and that became the thing that really set his life work. So, of course, we went on from EEGs to MRIs, and this is an fMRI, and the difference is that it actually measures blood flow, so that when blood flow increases in the brain, it registers. And that's the difference between there's no danger to this. It's perfectly safe. There's no radiation or anything else, which was one of the reasons. This monk is probably one of 7 that were sent to Wisconsin later on. And incidentally, we're talking about Wisconsin here because that was early on. Now, as we'll see, most big universities have a section that does nothing but look at what goes on in the mind using MRIs and fMRIs. This, you probably can't see it, but I threw it in anyway, just because it shows the difference between the types of scans. Okay, so this is what Davidson much more recently has done. And this is a very interesting study. And as I say, Harvard has done a lot of studies, Stanford has done a lot of studies, and probably the University Toronto, I'm sure, has done many studies. I chose this one because it's interesting from several points of view. And one of the ways it was interesting was the way it was set up. It was a very interesting design that shows a little bit about meditation. And just before we go into it, what you'll find, or doubtless many of you meditate, I'm probably talking to the choir here, but when you're, just to remind myself, when you're in a state of meditation, things happen outside. Now, I am talking about, we'll get on to this distinction, mindfulness, not mindful meditation, but a meditation on, say, compassion. So you're in your zone and you're focused on compassion. You're in silence, but things happen in the outside world and you're aware of them. You can sense that they happened, but you don't record them. They don't stay. You may remember when you're asked afterwards, oh, did anything happen to your meditation? You may say, oh, yeah, I think someone came into the room, or I heard a bird go by, or heard a truck, or I heard, but you're not aware of it. So what they did for this particular study, and that's something that's worth remembering, that you're aware of what can go on. So they took 16 experts, and these were real experts. They were mostly Tibetans, but they were some Westerners who had meditated 10,000 hours. Now, I've been meditating since 1981 every day, but I sure don't meditate an hour every day. And to get to 10,000 hours is incredible. So they're really expert. They're right in the zone. And then they took 16 others, and incidentally, only 2 of them were women. This was done a little while ago, fairly shocking, but this came from the Dalai Lama, and I must say it's somewhat dominated by males. So the novices were just told how to meditate, not unlike what I've just shown you here. They were asked to meditate an hour a day for a week in 20-minute sessions. And they were to start on focusing on their family. And we're talking about a compassion meditation. So about loving kindness to the family, and then gradually broadening it out to all sentient beings, which is what they did. Now, in the study, this is what they did. They had the researchers had two sounds, a woman in distress for a negative sound and a baby laughing for a positive sound. So they played these at random during the meditation, during the time people were in the machine, in the MRI. And they were in the MRI for about 20 minutes, 10 minutes each, resting, and then 10 minutes of actual meditation mixed up. And then they were asked something else. It's talking about consciousness again. They're physically asked, well, was it good meditation or was it a poor meditation? And after you come out, as meditators know, you can tell whether was it good or not. Did you have a good meditation today? Yeah, it was a good one. Or no, it wasn't so hot. So they needed that to look at, to evaluate that. So let's have a look at the scans. So the top, the A, B, C, and D are the control group. They're when they're not meditating. They're just being as they normally are. And of course, there are significant, the C and D are the novices, and A and B are the very 10,000 hour plus meditators. And they have an awareness even when, and this isn't explained terribly well in the study, but the blue represents the anxiety part of it. That would be the woman's scream in the experiment, in the study. Yellow and orange would be the equivalent of the baby's laugh, happy sounds. And an interesting thing is that the long-term meditators stay attuned to that consciousness much, much more, don't forget 10,000 hours, much more than other people normally would. Most of us, and certainly if you haven't meditated at all, are C and D, that's what the mind looks like. Not much going on when it comes to either distress or joy, negative or positive. So then we look at the actual what happened during the meditations, and we see that in E, the blue area, that is the distress. And the experts, the meditators, were very aware of it. It's quite a strong impression. And there was also substantial impressions, particularly in F, of the joy. So distress, joy. Less so in the trainees who'd only been actually meditating for a very short time, but there was some. They were able to develop some compassion, and when they heard that baby laugh, this is what lit up. So when the woman screamed in this case, in E you got the blue, but still some of the joy stayed there, and that was essentially the study. So let's look at the results. So they were meditating on unconditional loving kindness and compassion. And the MR used something called BOLD. I meant to explain this earlier. BOLD, and it's oxygen level. Anyway, it measures an increase in oxygen at certain points in the brain, and that's what registers. Unconditional loving kindness and compassion are the main things that Tibetan Buddhists focus on. And it's something that meditation, whatever kind of meditation you use, leads you in that direction. So the results of this particular study, they found that there was more response during meditation, which we saw on the slides, and it was the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, that showed the highest activation when the intensity of the meditation was highest. And the intensity of meditation, they simply, again, asked the participants, well, did you have a good meditation? Was it intense? Was it not intense? So that was important. And the regions of the brain that reacted most to the sounds had to do with your level of compassion. The more compassionate you were, both negative and joyous sounds registered more. So this is the kind of study that's being done. This one, they're all related, but there are many different ways to approach it. But I chose this one out of, there are more than 500 studies going on right now at various places. So there's an intense interest in it. All the results are not exactly like this, but they are similar, surprisingly similar. So now, what kind of meditation are these people studying? They're studying mindfulness. It's Buddhist meditation, the way it's practiced by Tibetan Buddhists. And I have to say, Buddhists in the States and Western Europe, States, Canada, also use a very similar form. And the essential thing in it is that you concentrate on your breath. That's part of it. You bring you back using your breath. But you also, in a mindful meditation, in mindfulness, the word is sometimes incorrectly used, which is pay attention. It's not that. A mindful meditation, you go into the zone, go into your meditation, and in it, you stay aware of what's going on outside. You stay completely aware. So if a bird goes by or the truck, you note it. You might even pay attention to it. You also try to pay attention to the emotions and what's going on inside you. So you pay attention to those two things. And when you find you're thinking about the grocery list or, where you're going to sleep tonight or what are you going to eat, you bring yourself back to your breath. So that's essentially the kind of meditation that Buddhists and people practicing mindfulness do. And I'll talk a bit more about that when we get farther on. Now, this guy is John Kabat-Zinn. He invented mindfulness. Can you believe it? This is the guy who invented it. Of course, the Buddha was about 2,500 years ahead of him, but he is credited with inventing it, and he did invent it. He invented it when he was at the University of Massachusetts in 1979. And how did he get onto it? He was a psychologist and a great guy. And if you look at any of the videos of the Mind and Life Institute, you'll see he's still very active, and he's very famous now for mindfulness. He used it academically. He was interested in stress, and he used it for stress reduction. So forget compassion and all of the things that other people have used it for. He used it for stress reduction, reducing anxiety, and so on. How did he get onto it? Well, he got onto it from this guy, Philip Kapleau. Philip Kapleau was an American from Connecticut, a Zen Buddhist who wrote a book called The 3 Pillars of Zen. And he happened to visit the University of Massachusetts and met our friend and told him about Buddhism and told him about meditation. And that's how Zen got onto it. Now, I am very interested in this picture because I only discovered it last night. And I know 2 of these people really rather well. The woman is somebody that I always knew as Maitreyi, She was when I knew her, a follower of Sri Chinmoy, a meditator, and she ran a part of a center in Toronto. And the little girl, I was stunned to see. I knew her father was Philip Kapleau, was very famous. Now he started a big Zen center in Rochester. I know her as Sudarshana, which is her spiritual name, and she's now probably in her 50s. So, very beautiful woman. Maitri died a few years ago and was given a big send-off from the Rochester Zen Center, which Philip Kapleau founded. So that's a little aside. Okay, so you looked at some of that. The meditations that we've looked at were from the University of Wisconsin, but Harvard has been very big in it. And one of the leading lights there is Sarah Lazar. And I urge you to have a look on YouTube and watch one of her videos. Because I was going to show one of the videos, but I thought it would be safer simply to go through what she discovered. So she was an interesting case. She was a runner, and a very good runner, and she had an injury and couldn't continue to practice. This is about, more than 20 years ago. Somebody suggested yoga. She got into yoga. She became interested in meditation and what went on. And so she finally became an academic and a researcher at Harvard. She's done a TED Talk. She's worth listening to. She looked at it in a slightly different way, and she checked the brains of meditators and found out, compared to a control group, that there were a lot more neural connections in the heads of those who meditated. She also noted that the volume of the hippocampus got bigger, and the amygdala, I think I misspelled it, shrank. And the first has to do with positive feelings and so on, the second more with fear and worry and so on. So it was significant that the actual volume decreased. She also studies aging, and this is certainly of interest to me and everyone else, and finds that in the meditating brain, everybody's brain gets smaller as you get older. But when she compares meditating brains to normal, to people who don't meditate, the brain shrinks less slowly. So I urge you to have a look at some of her videos online. She's very interesting, and she's an animated presenter. And her present study is on meditation and aging. She's doing a 2, 4, and 10-year study on people between 69 and 85. So it's of interest to me anyway. And those results will be publishing regularly, so if you follow her, you'll be able to find them online. She was also, of course, neuroplasticity. Bill would know much more about that than I do. But it just means that they've only relatively recently discovered, as I think many of you probably know, that it's extremely adaptable. The brain can do all kinds of things we don't imagine they possibly could do, and they will adapt to changes. And we've had a wonderful example of that with our 15-year-old pug. He was 15 on the 13th of March, and his back legs are beginning to grow. And 2 or 3 times in the last month, they've completely let him down, so they couldn't move them. And it's clearly neurological, not physical. But through working at it, he doesn't give up. He's a gutsy, sort of feisty, tough kind of guy. He just keeps at it. And so physiotherapists also know this, of course. They gradually come back. And watching the dog, it's a miracle. One day he can't walk. He tries. The next day he gets it going. And later that day he can walk to the end of the block. Not perfectly, but it shows certainly a good example of neuroplasticity. How are we doing for time? Okay, well, we're nearly done. This is a little more on Sarah Lazar. She's anxiety, fear, mindfulness in the brain. She's at Harvard and the Massachusetts General Hospital. That's a look at her. I urge you to check her out on YouTube. Stanford, I looked at a lot of other studies. Stanford has been huge in it. There are over 500 studies going on. They have a huge compassion cultivation training, science-based compassion. They have regular seminars all year round. I love the fact that they had this fleur-de-lis. I don't know how that is, but it reminds me of Quebec. So they're certainly worth looking into. Stanford, I didn't want to leave them out. It doesn't say Stanford here, but that's who these people are. We're coming to the end. This is something Sarah Lazar also touched. There are many different styles of meditation. There's Tibetan, there's Hindu, which I'll talk about briefly. There's Zen. You can meditate using mantras. You can chant. The most well-known chant is Om. That's a very common chant. There's Vipassana, which is sort of meditation boot camp. You go for 10 days and you meditate virtually all the time. I've never done it. It's very difficult. There are music meditations. They can take you there as effectively as otherwise. There are guided meditations, visualization, Buddhist, and mindfulness, which I've discussed. They all work. It's a little bit like exercise. Some work some parts of the mind more than others, so you can combine them, mix and match. Once you've learned to meditate, you don't forget. It's a bit like riding a bike, though when you get on again and start, you may be a little rusty, so it takes. So this is my meditation teacher, Sri Chinmoy. I started with him in 1981. He at the time was giving twice weekly meditations at the United Nations. And he has since met a huge number of people in the world. He died in 2007. He was a friend of Mother Teresa, Mandela, Gorbachev. I was with him when he met Gorbachev for the first time, and they had a friendship that lasted his whole life. So he was well known and respected. And for me, he was a terrific meditation teacher. Now, he taught a Hindu style meditation, which I now call God-centered meditation. Not everybody does that. Mindfulness is not God-centered meditation. It may surprise you somewhat, but the Dalai Lama is not a huge believer in God, or what he's told his followers is, you let me worry about that theology. You just live peaceful, happy lives, and that's the way you should go. So that's Sri Chinmoy. He died in 2007. He has published a book, and I'll say it's a classic guide to classic meditation. And again, I say this is this has to do with the divine, with the supreme, with that kind of that life. This is a book that Bill mentioned, and it's a very interesting book. If you are interested in Buddhism and how it works and have been confused or wondered about what it all meant, what detachment and non-self and all these terms meant, it's very well described in Robert Wright's book, and I've enjoyed it tremendously. He does a Vipassana meditation, that 10-day thing. He considers himself a good lab rat because he has attention deficit disorder, and meditation helps. And he makes a fairly good case that we might be happier if we followed some of the precepts of the Buddha, that it would reduce our anxiety and suffering in the world. So that's it for today. Thank you very much. I hope there was enough science to keep the mind alive.
Thanks, David. Anybody have any questions? Just unmute and you can start to talk so we don't miss anybody.
Well, hi, David. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. It's Jane. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can.
Yes? Oh, good. I'm curious if you dipped into any Christian forms of meditation from the mystics. I was thinking of the Teresa of Avila, for instance, and I just wondered if there's a compare and contrast that you have with the styles. I mean, obviously, Teresa's is God-centered as well, so I just wondered where you see the connections and the contrasts.
Well, it's a great question, and I am interested in, as you know, I'm a good Anglican these days, and that's something important to remember about meditation. It doesn't preclude you being a Roman Catholic, a Muslim, or a pagan. Well, the pagan might convince you to give up paganism. In Christianity, as far as I know, prayer fairly early on became the preferred way of dealing with God. And I haven't talked about prayer, and because I haven't talked much about God-centered meditation, but for me, prayer is important. Sri Chinmoy said, when we pray, we talk to God. When we meditate, we listen to God. And I find that's a good analogy, but the two fit together very well. Yes, I think that Christianity could benefit from more meditation, and there is certainly a movement in that direction. Bill has sent me some things, some very interesting things about the power of meditation among Christian clerics who talk about it. So I don't know if that's an answer. I'm familiar with it. I think that monks and monasteries are great places for retreats and for meditation, and I think that Christianity could benefit from more of it. Let me put it that way.
Yes, I think that there was sort of a division of labor, and the monastic tradition carried the contemplative part of it, and the parish tradition, the active part, and that intersection would be beneficial. Yes.
Good. Okay. So good. Thank you all very much for coming. I enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't totally incomprehensible. And I'll send out, as Bill did last week, with a few books and some websites you can go to. I mean, the web is just inundated with stuff on meditation and particularly mindfulness. But there's so many different types, it's overwhelming. So I'll send you some sites that I've found helpful anyway.
David, Bill Brown, I just wanted to thank you very, very much. This is a real challenge to cover a subject like this in an hour, and you covered the science, but you also talked about the history of it and some allusion to your own personal life, which I think was all very, very important. So thank you very much. It's exactly what I expected. A very worthy cap to this series. So thank you, David.
You really do know what you're doing, eh, Dr. Brown?
Well, I don't know that I do, but I think David
Well, I'll take full credit. You put this thing together, and it was a very good choice.
Thank you very much for doing this, Debbie. It's just been great.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Any other questions quickly before I let you go and say goodbye one more time?
And also, thank you, Bill, for giving me the opportunity.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Brown, what would we do without you?
I don't know. But anyway, we'll see.
And with that, goodbye, everybody.
Well, we have
a nice
fun.
afternoon.
We
Yes,
have
we
fun.
We
do.
do have fun.
Yeah, we have
We'll
fun.
talk.
Okay.
We'll talk
right.
soon, everybody. We'll talk soon.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Oh gosh.
That's where we should smile. Like today is the perfect day, just as Piglet and Pooh say.
Exactly. You started off very, very well. Very strong, David. There are many days I feel just like that.
My favorite day.
It's your favorite day.
Okay.
Well, if you're not laughing, you're crying these days. So this is like perfect.
Right.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Okay.
All right.
I do think there's some room to actually expand on some of this material.
Oh,
so maybe some further conversations. I certainly have that feeling about the brain series because we barely touched a whole lot of stuff.
Oh yeah.
So, and David has kind of opened up some doors here. So I think it's really interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a conversation we'll have.
We will. Absolutely. David, you can do a whole series.
Yeah, there we go.
Bill can do Brain 2.
Brain 2.
Brain 2.
Brain 2.0.
Yeah.
I'll take the right side. You take the left.
Very good.
I was very interested in those fMRI pictures. I mean, I would have to look at them directly about which areas were actually lighting up.
Right.
And but I thought that's interesting material. So.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. So,
okay.
Yeah. Thanks again, David, for so much effort.
It was fun.
So well explained too.
It was fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
That's it. I'm going to hit end.
Thanks, Deb.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
See you on what's
May 5th.
May 5th. Yeah.
But I'll be in touch.
About 3/4 of it done now.
Infoway.
Yeah. I'll be in touch before then.
So I hope at least Elizabeth shows up since she asked the question.
That's true. That's exactly. You're doing this for her. We'll make sure. We'll send her a link whether she wants it or not.
Yeah. Well, after all my efforts, she's going to get it anyway.
That's right.